Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is video 10 from the Beginner to Chess Master playlist, which is a progressive series of videos. And we're going to have a look at some chess pawn basics. We're going to have a look at a group of 10 chess terms. I'll be providing the definitions of each, showing what that looks like on board, and in some instances giving some very basic tips. Let me remind you of the importance of doing a video such as this. When it comes time for me to speak on more advanced topics, it's important that we have a certain vocabulary under our belt. I do not want to have to stop along the way in those videos and be providing definitions. This will enable me to speak a bit more freely on those topics. So with that said, let me give you a very quick breakdown of the terms to be covered in this video. It runs as follows. We're going to have a look first. We're going to have a look at what a passed pawn is, also known as a passer. We're also going to have a look at what a protected passed pawn is, isolated pawn, doubled pawns, hanging pawns, backward pawn, candidate passed pawn, fixed pawn, pawn island, and one more, pawn chain. So let's take it right from the top, looking first at what a passed pawn is, or a passer. What is that? That is a pawn that no enemy pawn can stop on its way to queening. So by that definition, and in this example, there's only one passed pawn, there's only one passer, and that is the pawn on g7. There is no enemy pawn, no white pawn in this case, anywhere on the g file that can be blocking it on its way to that queening square g1, nor is there any enemy pawn on these adjacent files, the files next to the g file, the F and H file, that can be capturing the pawn on its way to the g1 square. These tend to be quite valuable. Having a passed pawn, they tend to increase in value as more and more pieces are exchanged off the board. One reason why a passed pawn is a great strength, it's because a piece of greater value, your opponent's knight, bishop, king, queen, or rook, will be responsible, will have some job now of stopping this pawn from promoting. Let's move forward here, looking next at what a protected passed pawn is. What does that look like? What's the definition? The definition, it's a passed pawn that has a pawn of the same color protecting it. So this pawn here is the protected passed pawn. He's passed and has the protection of this friendly pawn of the same color, pawn on g4. This is quite valuable to have in chess, having a protected passed pawn, especially so in a simplified position such as this, in a king and pawn ending. If we take stock of this position, looking at it from a material standpoint, we see that each side has a group of 3 pawns, so material is balanced. However, this arrangement of pawns, having this protected passed pawn, is super valuable. Why is that the case? Well, let's see. Notice how the white king is able to approach these 2 pawns over here, and what does black do in the meantime? Unfortunately, he has to sit and wait, and it's an unfortunate strategy, but what else is there to do? If you're going to try to capture this pawn, you must first capture him, but if you're ever even approaching this pawn takes off in queens. So black is basically paralyzed. He's stuck here, cannot move, cannot go away. He has that job of watching out for this pawn, or watching out so that this pawn does not queen. And what happens in the meantime is that these 2 black pawns are exchanged for just 1 white pawn. The queen side, the smoke over here, the A, B, C, and D files, the queen side of the board, the smoke has cleared there, and now the white king is able to come over towards the king side, scoop up the G pawn, and now push right through and get that queen. So protected passed pawn, a great asset in the game. Moving forward, looking next at what an isolated pawn is. This idea of isolated pawns or isolated pawn structures in chess is a big one. However, I'll just be touching on what the definition is. An isolated pawn is a pawn with no pawns of the same color on the files next to it. If you don't like that definition, you could just view it as a pawn that's all by himself and can't be protected by any of your other pawns. In this case here, the isolated pawn, the only isolated pawn is this pawn on d4. just a quick tip regarding isolated pawns. If you're playing on the black side here, if your opponent has an isolated pawn, when you're able to identify an isolated pawn in the game, look at the squares directly in front of the isolated pawn. So again, if you're playing on the black side, you're looking at these squares here, just giving you a general feel. The squares directly in front of an isolated pawn tend to be excellent homes for your pieces, your knights, your bishops, etc., because they cannot be chased away, they cannot be attacked by enemy pawns. Moving forward, looking next at doubled pawns. What's a doubled pawn? A doubled pawn is when you have two pawns of the same color that are on the same file. So by that definition, black has doubled B pawns. These have a tendency to be a liability in chess, doubled pawns. Not all the time. Some of the times they can be a liability. I'd like to emphasize the word sometimes, because I think players early on, they learn of doubled pawns, and in their mind they learn that doubled pawns are bad, and in their mind they have this idea that it just gets the big red X, avoided at all costs. But do know that there are other pieces of criteria that one needs to be looking into before you just write off having doubled pawns in your own position. There could be some positives. I'll illustrate that soon enough. In this particular case, this is an instance where the doubled pawns are very bad. They're a great liability in this case. We could even go one step further. These are not just doubled pawns, but in fact double isolated pawns. Double isolated pawns are almost always really, really bad. There are rare cases where they can be quite useful, but for the most part, doubled isolated pawns are really, really bad. In this case here, these two pawns are stopped by just this one guy here. These two pawns here, what we might regard as a healthy pawn majority on the king side, having two pawns versus just one black pawn on this king side of the board. These guys here can produce a passed pawn. Let's see that in action. First, both kings getting towards the center a little bit. And now what does white do? Pushes, capture, capture, and what do we have? We know what this is. It's a passed pawn. It's a passer. And what does black have to do now? Well, he's diverted away from this side of the board. He has to hunt down this pawn, and in the meantime, white scoops up those two doubled pawns and will now be successful pushing through to queen. Let's have a look at another example regarding doubled pawns, just showing what that looks like. Again, this here is an instance of doubled pawns for white, doubled E pawns, and for black, doubled B pawns. If I'm to just change this position, or I should say add some pieces to the board and shift these pawns back like so, this is what it's going to look like, this position right here. This here is a case where it's white to move, and there's some tension between these bishops, right? If it's white's turn to move, he could capture the bishop. If it's black's turn to move, he could capture here. Now, if you're a player of the mentality where I want to avoid doubled pawns, they're no good, well, as the white side, you may say, well, I'm gonna capture this bishop. I don't want to allow my opponent to capture me, and then I have to go like this, and I have doubled pawns. And at the same time, you might be saying as white, well, now what have I done to black? I've doubled his pawns, aha. Well, hang on, there's other pieces of criteria to look into. Not only did you double his pawns, but you could look at it from the black perspective here, you helped the rook out. There's other pieces of criteria that go into pawns being doubled. In fact, if it's black's turn to move, let me make a passing move here. On the black side, do you really want to capture this bishop? White has doubled pawns, but you brought the rook to life. This is now a half-open file. You've helped white in some sense, and maybe there's a good reason that white would want to have this square controlled by a pawn. There's other pieces of criteria that need to be considered when it comes time to have your pawns doubled. That could be quite useful. Just know that much. Don't write them off as being completely bad. They're not completely bad. Okay. Let's move forward here, looking next at what hanging pawns are. Let's see an example of what hanging pawns are. Hanging pawns are when you have two pawns of the same color that are together and don't have any pawns of the same color on the files next to them. Okay, that was a mouthful. Here's what it looks like. This right here is an instance of hanging pawns. Each of these pawns, just note that each of these pawns will often be positioned on half-open files, as is the case right here. White has these two half-open files, the C and D file. There could be some pressure placed on them. These could be a strength, they could be a weakness. It will depend on many different things. I just want to give you a visual of what this looks like. Notice there are no other black pawns here that could be helping them out. They're on their own. They could only protect each other. He could advance and have the support of this guy and vice versa. They're going to likely need the support of other pieces. White will soon have pressure on them with the rooks. They could be, again, a strength or weakness. It will depend on the situation. A strength in that they could advance, maybe change the structure at some point. Downside, a weakness in that, again, they can't be defended by any other pawns. They're by themselves. They'll require the support. They'll need the support, most likely, by these other pieces. These other pieces will have to defend them. So that's what the hanging pawns look like. Let's move forward here, looking next at what a backward pawn is. A backward pawn is a pawn that trails behind a pawn of the same color on an adjacent file. So in this particular case, the two backward pawns are this one here for black, the D7 pawn, and for white, the B4 pawn. They trail behind this lead pawn right here. This would be the lead pawn for white, and this would be the lead pawn for black. So they're not able to move. They're not able to make one move and have the support of another pawn. This is a deficiency within a structure when you have an instance of one of your pawns being backward, and this is compounded quite often when we have situations like this. I'm just going to quickly alter this position where I insert a couple pawns. These two here just popping up, these make life all the more difficult. These make life that much more difficult for the backward pawns. Not only can they not advance and have the support of any of their pawns, like this guy here, he cannot advance and have the support of a black pawn. Not only is that the case, but now there's a white pawn here who's making it even more difficult for him to try to get here and advance to get out in front where he could one day be protected. Similarly, white cannot advance like this so easily anymore either, because there's a black pawn here clamping down on this b5 square, controlling that b5 square. Okay, let's move forward, looking next at what a candidate passed pawn is. A candidate passed pawn is the pawn of a pawn majority that can produce a passed pawn, and that is on a half-open file. So in this case here, the candidate pawns, notice each side here has a majority. Black has this 2-1 majority on the king side of the board, and when it comes time for the queen side, it is white who has a pawn majority of 2-1. Let me just clear that out. So by that definition, we can identify the candidate passed pawns. They will be this guy here and this guy here, the ones that are on the half-open files. There's a certain general rule of thumb that we can follow when we're trying to successfully advance our pawn majority like this. Again, a pawn majority that is able to produce, a pawn majority that can produce a passed pawn. A general rule of thumb we can follow is that the candidate pawn should lead the way. So when you're playing on the white side here, if you're playing the move a4, that's an excellent way to make progress here. You go a4, you go b4, and then you finally go a5, just making some dummy moves on the black side. That's a good way to go ahead and successfully create what is now a passed pawn. If you are to do a different order, if you are to not follow that rule of thumb with candidate pawn should lead the way, suppose this guy goes first, well, guess what? This pawn is what? he's a bit backward. And notice that previous example of backward pawn, what is black able to do? Clamp down in this A4 square. How significant is this really? Well, it's very significant. You play B4 in this position, you lose because of black playing this, and this pawn can now not advance successfully. You could create a passed pawn still like this, but you've given black a passed pawn as well. So the short story here, these are the candidate passed pawns, and they are the ones that should be leading the way on your way to taking your majority and converting it into a passed pawn. All right, let's move forward here, looking at just 3 more terms. Next one here, looking at what a fixed pawn is. A fixed pawn is a pawn that cannot move due to an enemy pawn blocking it. That's a simple definition. The fixed pawns in this position are these two here. Basically, it's known as a ram structure. 2 pawns basically butting heads here. Neither one can move. The other, each pawn here is blocking it, and they're known as fixed pawns. Let's have a look at another example of fixed pawns in this position. These pawns here are all fixed. We might also consider this as a closed center when we have when we identify certain positions in chess. Sometimes we identify it as open position. Open positions are where there are several pawns that have been exchanged. Other positions are closed. This would be an example of a closed position, one where we have many instances, in other words, of fixed pawns. Let's have a look at now a pawn island. Pawn island is a group of pawns of one color on consecutive files with no other pawns of the same color on any adjacent files. That's a little bit messy of a definition there. Let's just see what it looks like. Pawn islands. Black has 3 pawn islands. He has a group of 2 highlighted right here. He has another pawn island, a pawn island of 3, and a pawn island of 2. In total, black has 3 pawn islands, whereas white has 2 pawn islands. White has a group of 3, and white also has a group of 4. These pawns here, the B4 pawn, C2, D2, and E3, they are a group of 4. They can be connected at some point. They can be put together and protecting one another. They're considered islands. In general, it's said in chess that the fewer pawn islands you have, the better, and that's primarily due to you want your pawns to be able to watch over one another. When you start off the game, each side has, let's say, 1 pawn island each, 1 pawn island of 8. That doesn't mean that you don't ever want to make a pawn exchange, because you would break your pawn island up into 2. There's other pieces of criteria to be looking into. If you don't have a pawn capture, you're not going to have play for your rooks. But just in general, there's this idea where the fewer the pawn islands you have, the better. And let's have a look at just one last example here, looking at what a pawn chain is. As a close here, a pawn chain is simply a fixed and connected diagonal formation of pawns. We can identify the fixed pawns in this case. We've already looked at what fixed pawns are, and we have an instance of these guys being here on a diagonal. Just providing a couple more quick terms here. This pawn here is regarded, the furthest advanced pawn of this diagonal is considered the head of the pawn chain, and the guy that's furthest back is considered the tail or the base of the pawn chain. And looking at it from black's perspective, this would be the head of the pawn chain looking from black's perspective. In fact, let me just flip the board. This would be the head of the pawn chain, and this here would be the tail or the base of the pawn chain. This is certainly another topic to spend some more time on, but for now, as mentioned at the start of the video, we're just looking at the definitions. There will be plenty more to be elaborating on with some of these terms, but for now, hopefully this has been quite useful to you as we move forward here. And as always, I hope you got something out of this video, and I look forward to sharing video 11 with you. So that's all for now. Take care. Bye.